Good morning. What a great idea to start a breakfast early in the morning after St. Patrick's Day. So I want to tell you a little bit about irrational behavior. And behavioral economics is actually a very applied field, and my interest in this field started from a very applied perspective. Many years ago, I was injured in an explosion, and I spent a long time in hospital as a consequence of this. And hospitals, by the way, are a wonderful place to watch all kinds of irrational behaviors. But the thing that was most difficult for me in this case was the process of removing bandages. So I was in the burn department, 70% of my body was burned, and taking bandages was a huge part of my daily torture. Now, if you think about it, you all must have taken the Band-Aid off at some point, and you all must have wondered what's the right approach. Do you rip it off? Short duration, but every second is very painful. Or do you take it off slowly? Many seconds, but each second is less painful. Which one of those is better? You have your own intuitions. It turns out the nurses in my department thought that the right approach was the ripping approach. So they would grab hold and they would rip a bandage. They would grab hold the next one, they would continue. And because I had so much of my body burned, it took about 45 minutes to an hour to do this. And as you can imagine, I hated with passion this moment of tearing. You know, it's one thing to take a Band-Aid off when it's just the glue that sticks to it. It's another thing when you have no skin and the bandages really adhere to the flesh. It's incredibly painful. I'm not, not wishing this on anybody. And I used to argue with the nurses. I used to say, why don't we do it a different way? Why don't we take it slower? Take 2 hours, but don't have this really terrible tearing. I mean, I didn't say this calmly, of course, but I would try to convince them to do this. And the nurses told me two things. They told me, first of all, that they were right, that they had the right model of the patient, that they knew what would cause me less pain. And the second thing they told me is that the word patient doesn't mean intervene, make suggestions, but in... this was in Israel, but it turns out it's in every language I've known since then. So I didn't keep exactly quiet, but the nurses kept on doing what they thought was the right thing to do for the next 3 years. When I got out of the hospital, I learned about the experimental method. One of the most interesting lessons at college was that sometimes if you have a question, you can create a parallel of that question in a lab, and you can investigate it very carefully, and you might come up with an answer. So I was still bothered with this question of how people integrate experiences over time. And what I decided to do was to do an experiment on this. I didn't have much money in the beginning, so I went to a hardware store and I bought a carpenter's vise, and I would bring people to the lab and I would crunch their fingers a little bit. And I would crunch the fingers for short duration and long duration. Pendant went up, pendant went down, with breaks, without breaks. And when I finished each of these little crunches, I would ask people, so how painful was this and how painful was that? And if you had to choose one of the last two, which one would you do again? And as I finished this round of experiments, like all good academic projects, I got more funding. I moved to electrical shocks and sounds. Better equipment. And what I learned at the end was that the nurses were wrong, and they were wrong in multiple counts. First of all, it turns out that we don't encode duration that much. So when you prolong an experience, you don't actually prolong the pleasure or pain by the same amount that you prolong it. Right? Think about it. If this lecture was going to be twice as long, it wasn't necessarily twice as pleasurable or painful, you can decide. But the moments of intensity, the peak experiences, the actual intensity matters a lot. So the nurses were wrong in that regard. The nurses were also wrong because it turns out that the way that pain progresses over time matters a great deal. Pain that starts high and goes lower over time is perceived as much better than pain that starts low and increases. And the nurses, for reasons of comfort, started with my feet, which were less painful, and moved to my head, which was most painful, creating a worse process of change over time. And finally, it turns out giving people breaks in the middle is actually very helpful. It gets people to help to kind of recover some of the coping energies. So I went back to the department and I talked to them, and the big thing that puzzled me was how could the nurses be wrong? You know, in economics we think about a few conditions to getting things right. People should want to get things right. The decision should be in high stakes, so they should matter, and they should have plenty of experience. And the nurses had all of those components. Now it's true these decisions were more important for me than for them, but still, they were still important for them as well. And how could they be wrong? And are nurses the only people who are getting things wrong in a repeated, systematic way, despite the fact that it's their profession and they're experts in it? And from that point on, I started looking at all kinds of behaviors in which we might have the same kind of predictable, irrational tendencies in which we do things wrong repeatedly. Some of it is pain, and some of it has been in all kinds of daily life. Now, today I'll talk to you a little bit about cheating, you know, the fact that we have so much cheating in the news, and Madoff might make it particularly appealing topic for this week. So cheating. Like everything else, I usually become interested in the problem when I see something in the outside world, and in this case it was Enron. So Enron all of a sudden collapsed. Became very clear that there was all kind of deception going on there. And I was wondering to myself, what is going on? Is it the case that we had 3 bad apples, or was there something more systematic? And that's actually an important question, because if there were 3 bad apples, then you just want to eliminate bad apples. But if it's something more general, maybe you need to think about a different solution. So like everything we do, I decided to do a small experiment. And the basic structure of my experiment was the following. I took a sheet of paper with 20 simple math problems. These problems gave people a set of numbers, and they had to find 2 numbers that add to 10. 2.68, 7 point whatever, 32. And once you found the 2 numbers that add to 10, you solved that problem. Okay, so it's a problem. Everybody can add 2 numbers to 10. It just takes you some time to figure out which of the 2 numbers add to 10. I gave people a sheet with 20 questions like this, and I said, you have 5 minutes. When the 5 minutes are over, I'll give you $1 for each question you got correctly. If you were in the experiment, you would work hard for 5 minutes. When the 5 minutes are over, you would count how many questions you solved correctly. You would give me the sheet, and I would pay you, on average, $4. That's what people solve in 5 minutes. That's the control condition. In the second condition, the cheating condition, when the 5 minutes are over, we ask people to shred the piece of paper, put the pieces in their pocket or in their backpack, and tell us how many questions they solved correctly. Now, presumably, people are not smarter just because they shred the piece of paper, but now they claim to solve 7. Now, it's not as if we had a few bad apples that skewed the distribution. Instead, we had lots of people who cheated just by a little bit. Now, why do people cheat? The economic answers to cheating is very simple. The Becker model of cheating is that every day, when we walk by anything, we consider 3 things. Let's say we walk by a gas station. We say to ourselves, how much money is in the till? What's the chance they'll catch us? How much time will we get in prison? We weigh the cost-benefit analysis, and we decide whether to hit the gas station or not. And, you know, it sounds like a crazy model, and it is. But realize that this is the model that is driving the legal system. Right? So in some sense, it's an odd model, but it's a very important model in a practical way because of the role of economics in our society. Okay, so let's check this model. How would you check that model? Well, a big part of it is how much you stand to gain. So let's manipulate that. Some people, we told them we'll pay them 10 cents per correct question. Other people, 25 cents per correct question. 50 cents, $1, $5, $2, $10. Would it matter how much money people stand to gain? You would think so. Turns out it doesn't. Still, a lot of people cheat, but they cheat just by a little bit, and they don't seem to be sensitive to how much money they stand to gain. That's strange. What about the probability of being caught? Let's manipulate that. Some people we ask to shred half the sheet, so there's still some evidence remaining. Some people shred the whole sheet. Some people shred the whole sheet, leave the room, and pay themselves from a bowl of money that has over $100, right? Just pay yourself how much you deserve. Again, you would think that people would cheat more as the probability of being detected goes down. No, they don't. Still, a lot of people cheat, but they cheat just by a little bit. So what is going on here? It doesn't seem like the economic factors are driving it. What could be driving it? So we thought maybe what's happening is that there are two conflicting forces. One force is that we all want to look at ourselves in the mirror and feel good about ourselves. We want to feel that we're honorable, honest people. At the same time, we also want to benefit from cheating. So maybe what we do is we find an equilibrium, a resting point between those 2 points. We cheat up to the level that we would still be comfortable with our image in the mirror. We call this the fudge factor, right? How little we can cheat and still feel good about it. Think about your tax returns in this regard.